Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jim Dao, the opinion editor. We're having another roundtable today, and there's just no shortage of things to talk about. I want to dive into the new Epstein revelations from the Boston Globe, and we'll also discuss the Massachusetts Senate race, which has been kind of heating up, kind of not heating up. And later, we'll also discuss a big issue in Boston, which is snow, and it's still everywhere. But first, huge news over the weekend. Iran was attacked by Israel and the United States. I'm here with two Globe opinion writers, Joan Vennochi and Abdallah Fayyad. Thanks both for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to be here.
So we had planned on starting off with a conversation about the president's State of the Union speech, which was quite a bit of political theater last week. And then we woke up Saturday to the news that Israel and the United States had bombed Iran, and massive bombardment, and basically we've gone to war with Iran. And so on the first day alone of this bombardment, the supreme leader of Iran was taken out, a bunch of his deputies were taken out, and we've had all kinds of retaliation by Iran against U.S. bases in the region and Gulf allies of the United States, as well as Israel. Abdallah, why don't you start by telling us your thoughts about what's going on here?
Well, I mean, it's certainly, when it happened over the weekend, I was surprised. Part of the reason I was surprised was because the United States had been negotiating with Iran, and as recently as Friday, we had heard that those negotiations were moving forward, that there was hope of a breakthrough through mediators. That's what we heard. So it seemed like it was going in the right direction, but then there quickly started to become signs that it was going sideways. And, wake up all of a sudden and we're at war. It certainly does not feel like a last resort effort, as war always should be. It just seems like in the middle of negotiations that were supposed to be made in good faith, the United States and Israel decided to launch a war preemptively. And as a result, now we're going to deal with the consequences of that. Now, already at least 4 U.S. troops have died. Hundreds have been killed in Iran, including children from an elementary school, a girls' elementary school that was bombed. And so it's really hard to know now where this goes, but I'm definitely feeling very anxious about it.
The president tried to portray this as Iran as an imminent danger, that they were potentially moving towards rebuilding their nuclear infrastructure that had been destroyed last year, or that he said had been destroyed. Right. Do you buy that explanation?
Well, here's the thing. I don't. When it comes to the Trump administration's rationale for why they're in this war, it's been days now, and we haven't really heard any clear objectives or timelines or rationale for why Iran was an imminent threat to the United States. They haven't been convincing at all as to why Americans were in danger because of Iran. The latest comments we heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio was that Iran was a threat to the United States because if Iran was attacked, then it would attack U.S. bases, and they knew that Israel was going to attack Iran. So that, to me, points towards either incompetence or just, an eagerness to go to war, an inability to restrain one of our closest allies. So if the U.S. was afraid that Israel was going to bomb Iran, and as a result, then American lives would be in danger in U.S. bases, while negotiating, why was the Trump administration unable to restrain Israel? Why did they have to go ahead and launch the war? To me, the number one thing that the U.S. should have done in that moment is to tell Israel, its ally, which the United States has a lot of leverage over, to say, hold your horses, hold your fire. We're in the middle of negotiations. If you fire at Iran, then you're going to put American lives at risk. So to me, this shows some incompetence in negotiation. It shows some inability to restrain Israel for reasons unknown. And I think that's what ultimately makes this so reckless, because it seems like it was all that the parties involved were all too eager to go to war before trying diplomatic efforts in a meaningful way.
Joan, could I get you to talk a moment about the politics here? It's not been the best few weeks for Trump. He's down in polls, he's been sort of consistently low in the polls. The economy isn't picking up the way he had hoped. There's constant Epstein revelations that seem, potentially damaging to him or to people he knows. There's talk that this may have been an effort at distraction to some degree. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my first thought is that he stepped on whatever good might have come out of the State of the Union for him. And that even though the media kind of roundly denounced it, there was some indication that, from polling, that it was received, rather well by people who, by the general public. The two things that you remember from it is the U.S. men's hockey team showing up and Democrats declining to stand when he sort of made this issue of, are you with American citizens or are you with illegal aliens, in air quotes here. So whatever good came out of that, he might have, had a little bit of goodwill that might have given him a little bit of a turnaround in polling. Immediately runs up against the wall of this. Abdallah said he was surprised. I think a lot of people who don't follow these things very closely would be almost shocked by suddenly, they wake up to find out that we're at war with a country that not everybody knows all the details about why this would happen. I see it as a huge risk for him because he really hasn't explained why now, how he came to the decision. The initial explanations are all through these sort of prefab videos rather than kind of Q&A or like just really taking questions. And war is, you don't know how it's going to end. You don't know how it's going to unfold. So I think it's a big political risk for him.
We're still a long way, or relatively long way, from the midterm elections, but we are in a situation where gas prices are almost certainly going to go up. Crude oil per barrel is going up right now, quite a bit actually. Did he potentially hurt the Republicans' chances in November by doing this? What do you guys think?
You go first.
I think so. I mean, part of the reason being that Americans in the last couple of decades, for obvious reasons, have been in an anti-war mood.
Including Republicans.
Including Trump.
Including Trump. And the fact is that Trump ran on, at least he said, an anti-war platform. He portrayed in 2016 Hillary Clinton as the Iraq War supporter, as a warmonger. In 2024, he did the same about Biden and Kamala Harris, and that he was the peace president, that he was going to deliver peace through strength, whatever that means in whatever context they mean. But he essentially has been running for a while, for the last 10 years, on being, the anti-Bush, a kind of Republican that is not keen on remaking the world in America's image, that, let other countries figure out their own problems. We're not going to do regime change. He has said that many times. And so now, he has suddenly reversed on that position in the last couple months. We saw the capture of Maduro in Venezuela, and now we see the United States decapitate leadership in Iran, essentially, in the regime. And so there's a lot of, fear among, including some of his voters, but among Americans more broadly, that America's going back to the George Bush era, that we're going back to regime change wars. And I think no matter how this plays out militarily, even if the U.S. ends up having a much more successful military outcome than we might be anticipating right now, I think ultimately the optics of it show that Trump doesn't mean what he says, which a lot of people already know. But it also shows, at least I think it exacerbates this fear that America is going back to war on a permanent basis. And I think that's not what people want. So I think the only people right now who have to answer to this war are not Democrats, it's the Republicans. It's the Republicans in Congress, it's the Republicans running in their districts. And for Senate, they're going to have to answer for all of Trump's actions in this war. And I think that's going to be baggage by November.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate for one moment.
Please do.
I don't think Democrats are completely off the hook on this. He's framed it. I mean, everyone agrees that the supreme leader ran a reprehensible regime that, tortured and murdered their own people. So every Democrat has to start off by saying that, right? And saying, of course, I do not agree with what preceded here. And then they have to sort of rationalize, however, the way he did this was wrong and he didn't lay out the plan, et cetera, et cetera. It kind of makes the Democrats have to kind of first separate from being on the side of a terrorist regime.
Yeah.
And Trump is, unfortunately, an incredibly lucky politician. It may just play out. It could just be that Iran is so weakened that they can fight back for the 4 or 5 weeks, but they are going to sort of seek some sort of resolution that makes him look like he did what others couldn't do.
Yeah.
Boldly make a choice.
I think that seems quite plausible to me. They are in a little bit of a legalistic box where they're making the case about this violates international law, but do the average voters care about that? Hard to tell.
Joan's point is really good, which is I think Democrats' messaging is going to be all messed up because it doesn't seem like their messaging is that they're anti-war. They're just anti this process, and so that doesn't really reassure voters that if they were in charge, they would be against this.
Right. Nobody cares about process with Trump, right? Whether it's war, immigration, tariffs, or whatever. I mean, that was a starting point BT before Trump. It isn't anymore.
Until Saturday, all we had been talking about was Epstein and the most recent revelations about his emails, particularly in an amazing piece in the Boston Globe Spotlight last week. So let's talk for a minute about those Epstein emails. The list of Massachusetts people that have been named in them is quite staggering, starting with former Harvard President Larry Summers. There's a long list of prominent academics and even some local politicians. And I guess the Globe investigation found that Harvard is mentioned 12,000 times, which is really amazing. Following the Spotlight story, Larry Summers resigned from his teaching gig at Harvard. We're expecting more fallout. What do you guys think should happen to the people that are mentioned in these emails or who communicated with Epstein voluntarily after his 2008 plea deal where he admitted to trafficking underage girls? What's the right response to those folks?
Well, I have to say that the fallout has been amazing. And the connections to Harvard are amazing too. I mean, 12,000 mentions is a big number. I've had some sort of problems wrapping my head around the whole issue of consequences for people.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking about another reprehensible individual, Jeffrey Epstein. Nobody would defend what he stood for, what he did, the crimes that he was accused of. But now it's become the fallout seems to have kind of no end line. Emailing, having a relationship with them, accepting money from them. At what point is it guilt by association? These people aren't accused of crimes. They don't have any due process, but they're being sort of cut loose by their institutions.
Right.
I think that's the right question to think about is how where's the line of accountability in this whole scandal? And I think that one thing that's striking to me when it comes to the clamor for accountability is I think the root of it is that we just haven't seen accountability at the top level of this entire scandal. So obviously Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were put in prison. But beyond that, it can't be that it was just these two individuals who were responsible for this entire thing and that nobody who engaged with them engaged in any crime or nefarious activity at all.
Right.
This is one of those scandals where the more information that comes out, the more vindicated a lot of conspiracy theorists are. And so that, I think, gives them a lot to hold on to want accountability. And what we're seeing is, the President of the United States has been mentioned in these files time and time again, and he's still President of the United States, and there's no accountability. And the Department of Justice has entirely botched the release of the files. There have been reports of, one of the victims making statements to the FBI and the federal government accusing Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her. Those have been removed from the release, according to the New York Times and NPR. When those questions surround this entire scandal, then when you can catch somebody, even if they haven't committed a crime, even if their only crime was sending Jeffrey Epstein an email, then people are going to latch on to it, even if there wasn't, a real violation of the law, but because it does in a lot of these cases speak to their character. In the case of Larry Summers, for example, I think it does speak to his character in how prolific his emailing with Jeffrey Epstein was after his 2008 conviction. The content of what they were talking about, I think, also speaks to his character. And I think, there is room for that kind of social accountability in that regard, but I think people also want criminal accountability at some point as well.
So you feel that if all the emails were truly released and they weren't redacted, we'd see Donald Trump's name in there quite a bit more?
I think based on the reporting that's out there, is yes, we would see more references to him and specifically maybe answer some questions. I don't know that a full release would be the smoking gun for bringing down Donald Trump's presidency. But clearly there's something that's being hidden. I mean, naturally, this is a question that we as journalists would ask, is why is the Department of Justice redacting things they don't need to redact? And why are pages of these documents missing, where it so happens that the president presiding over the Department of Justice is explicitly mentioned in some pretty heinous accusations? Those are questions, whether those accusations actually end up being corroborated or are true or not. Those accusations, Trump has to answer to them. Trump has to answer to the American public. This is not a small scandal, but because we're so used to scandal with Trump, we're just moving on from it as though it's a scandal in and of itself that some of these pages are not released.
Yeah.
I would say this is another case where the Democrats have kind of been sort of backed into a strange corner where the accountability, there should be accountability. Right now, it's more about political retribution than the kind of accountability that Abdallah is talking about. I mean, we have Bill and Hillary Clinton being, sort of called in and, forced to testify under oath. Meanwhile, all of those, files that presumably mention Trump have been redacted and not made public. And I just think it just sort of adds to the whole cynicism about this, that this is really not about accountability. It's really not about the victims. It's really not about justice for them. It's about somehow using this as a way to sort of shame and humiliate certain people and get some sort of political pound of flesh out of it.
On the Democrats' part, you're saying specifically?
Well, it's just on everybody's part. I mean, I don't know that there's any nobility in any of this. Maybe actually some of the female lawmakers who pushed for the release of the files, who themselves had been victim of sexual assault and know what it takes. I'm thinking of Ayanna Pressley here in Massachusetts, and also fill in the name here.
Nancy Mace. Marjorie Taylor Greene.
And Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had a personal experience with it, align themselves with women who were victimized with this and sort of pushed for the release of the records. I actually think they were on the right side of it. But now it's just sort of devolved into this sort of political, this way to, drag the other side before the public.
Yeah. It's kind of a pretty bipartisan scandal, I guess, and maybe a wash as a result, politically.
I mean, right now that seems like it's the Democrats are on the worse end of it because of the Clintons.
Well, in some ways, yes, but I think it's the U.S. criminal justice system as a whole. I think because this inevitably is going to create a lot of distrust, only because the Epstein scandal has raised so many questions that the government has botched in answering, not just with these files, but preceding the files and
You're talking about like the federal prosecution that didn't go very far.
There just have been so many questions surrounding this that, it's given people a lot of questions of who is held accountable in the United States and who isn't. And when finally there's a release of the files, and then you see foreign leaders like the UK Prime Minister facing more struggles to hold on to his office than Donald Trump, who's explicitly mentioned in the files, while the Prime Minister isn't, but one of his appointees was. Then it does make you legitimately ask, how is it that in the United States people at the top seem to get away with anything? Now, we don't know what that thing is right here. There are a lot of questions as to what crimes, as Joan was saying, were committed if the people mentioned, have committed crimes. Obviously, many of them did not. But we're just not getting any answers, and I think that's the problem with this whole scandal.
Okay, let's move to local politics. I'd love to talk about the U.S. Senate race in Massachusetts this year, pitting Senator Ed Markey, a longtime member of Congress, against Seth Moulton, who's a House member and a considerably younger man. Moulton, to some degree, is running on age because Markey will be 80 at the time of the election. And Moulton is making the case for generational change. He's also politically quite different from Markey in that he's kind of a centrist, and Markey's, pretty standard liberal to progressive Democrat. So what do you guys think? It's been not the most eventful race. Is Moulton gaining any traction? What's your sense of that race right now?
Well, from the looks of it, it doesn't seem like Moulton is gaining traction. But I don't know how many people are really paying attention to it. The thing that I noticed is that basically every establishment politician in Massachusetts is backing Markey, whether they're a progressive like Michelle Wu or he just is ringing up the endorsements,
Right.
sort of left and right. So he is the candidate of the establishment.
Yeah.
And, if I were Moulton, not that I'm in the business of giving people political advice, I don't think the age thing is working.
Yeah.
Young versus old isn't working, but insider versus outsider seems like it might be a better theme.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think the age issue outside of Joe Biden doesn't really land as much as we thought it would. I think part of the reason is, first, just look at Donald Trump beating Kamala Harris. Clearly, age wasn't an issue. By the end of his term,
Yeah.
he will have been the oldest president in American history. But more than that, I think voters are pretty discerning about, what a candidate stands for, at least like based on what their rhetoric is. Like they might not, be able to judge a politician well before election day, but like the vibe or the energy of the candidate can really capture voters regardless of their age. A perfect example of this is Bernie Sanders,
Yeah.
So in this particular case, I think Ed Markey, as Joan says, he might be the establishment candidate as a result of getting all of these endorsements and clearly being the favored candidate among the establishment. But he's really good at navigating or walking this tightrope where he is the establishment. He's been in elected office for decades, and yet he still is able to present himself as the outsider, as the anti-establishment candidate. And Moulton is the more, establishment politics type of politician. Ed Markey walks, I think, that line really well in a way that his age doesn't become an issue because he's the progressive, he's outside the box. Regardless of how long he's been around, I think voters are able to see that, and age is kind of taking a back seat.
I mean, let's not forget, Ed Markey beat Joe Kennedy III.
Yeah.
He beat a Kennedy, and he did it with help from AOC.
Yeah.
Between AOC endorsing him, running around in sneakers, not shuffling around in a bathrobe and slippers,
Yeah.
and also embracing progressive causes really from the start of his campaign, of his career, which I think now is at least 50 years. He's kind of mastered the art of looking young enough to get by, or acting young enough to get by,
and acting authentic enough. I think that's what people feel is like he stands.
Well, he's got personality, right?
Right, and Moulton is just not liked by his fellow Democrats. He's just
kind of prickly.
He's like the kid that nobody wants to sit next to in lunch for whatever the reason. I mean, it sounds mean to say, but it's true. I mean, he's just not popular. He has that lean and hungry look.
Well, he did. Tell me if you thought he had a little bit of a success with the State of the Union. He brought a student, an undocumented student from Milford, I believe, to be in his party up at the Capitol, and then had to usher the student out because ICE or Homeland Security put up a social media post shouting him out and almost threatening that they would come in and bust him on the spot. It got Moulton, a lot of attention that day. I'd also note that Markey didn't go to the State of the Union. Very pointedly, was among a bunch of Democrats who didn't feel it was worth going to at all. Did Moulton get anything out of that? Do you think?
I think it was a small victory, and without knowing for sure, I would think that Markey probably decided not to go to the State of the Union after he found out who Moulton was bringing as a guest, because it was a pretty good get as a guest. But the State of the Union, as we said earlier, is so long ago, and I don't know how many people would really focus on that. I don't think it's really going to make that big of a difference.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think I don't like to predict things in politics anymore ever, but I think this is a sleepy race, and I think it's a tough hill to climb for Moulton to actually catch any fire now.
So moving on to a less sleepy race, we also have a fairly significant. All the Senate races are significant this year, actually, but one that's getting a lot of attention is in Maine. Where we have a couple Democrats trying to vying for the nomination to run against Susan Collins, the longtime moderate Republican from Maine. We've got this young upstart, relatively young anyway, Graham Plattner, who's a darling of the left, running against the current governor, Governor Mills. Very different people. Mills is kind of a centrist, I think it'd be fair to say. Plattner is a proud and loud progressive. And he gets a lot of attention. Not clear that he's ahead in the polls. I think the polls are really shaky. What do you guys think about that race? And is that some people are looking at it as going to providing clear evidence of the sort of progressive centrist divide in the Democratic Party? Is that a fair way of looking at it?
In that race, it's interesting because unlike in Massachusetts, I think age and establishment credentials really are making a difference, and they're
for Mills, you mean?
Against Mills, and
Mills.
Not helping her. I think she's late 70s. I would have to look up the exact age. She's been around in politics a long time. She is the candidate of the establishment, and I don't think that's helping her right now. Graham Plattner is just seen as a more interesting, dynamic person.
You touched on a point that I was thinking about, which is how age plays into elections. I think ultimately age isn't an issue in and of itself. Age is a factor. It contributes to why you might not get support in a way that your sex or race does, but it doesn't on its own. It's not on its own the only factor as to whether or not somebody's going to vote for you. And in the case of Mills, I think her age embodies the establishment type of politics. And unlike Ed Markey, she doesn't present herself as the anti-establishment candidate. And Plattner injects this energy. He injects a different kind of politics. And I think people are especially the Democratic base, are ready to throw anything at the wall and see what sticks. I think at this point they're kind of disheartened by where things are, and the old playbook just clearly has not been working. So maybe they do need a firebrand in Maine. Maybe that's what will unseat Collins. Maybe you need somebody who has a little bit of baggage and controversial history, but just if his politics is entirely different from what you're hearing from mainstream Democrats, then maybe it's worth a shot. The only thing is that the polls have been all over the place in this race, so it's hard to tell who's actually gaining steam and who's not.
And, the ultimate question for the Democrats is who can beat Susan Collins.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure Plattner's the guy who can do it.
Yeah.
Do you think Mills could?
Well, then you have two kind of establishment people, two centrists, and if the Democrats are a little bit more energized, then maybe.
I think it's an interesting setup because it's kind of like the same candidate. It's like Collins running against herself, just with like slight variations. And that, I think, the only thing that Mills would be counting on is like really strong anti-Trump sentiment to turn Democrats out. But is there really that hard of that hard of a line between the two? Like, is there that much differentiation that it'll excite people? I think in this race you need like fire and ice, not
interesting. Yeah.
Well, but I think that the Republicans and Trump saw the danger when they started backing down on immigration enforcement in Maine. I think they saw that as something that could really...
He actually did something to help Susan Collins, in other words?
I think he did. I think he had to choose between possibly losing and doing what he didn't want to do and help Susan Collins.
Yeah. He would never admit to it, however.
Never.
Speaking of the president, I did want to return to the State of the Union for a second. I was personally quite struck by how often he just frontally attacked Democrats as sick. He used a variety of incredibly derogatory terms. He told them they should be ashamed of themselves on repeated moments. And he did this thing where he called on them, Joan, you referred to this earlier, to take a stand about whether they thought the first duty of members of Congress was to protect the American people or illegal aliens, I think is how he referred to them. And when they, of course, none of them stood when he said that, and he then proceeded to berate them. I'm curious what you guys think of that scheme. Do you think it might have resonated, whether you agree with the substance of it or not? Do you think there are voters that would say, yeah, why aren't you standing? Isn't that a clear choice?
My first analysis, which I wrote, was that this was a terrible thing, and that Trump had sort of once again played upon fears and was something that would backfire. A week later, I'm not sure. I think he played it probably exactly right. The first hour of the speech was more of a what's the word I'm looking for? It was more of a general appeal to people that wouldn't really offend anybody. He didn't really sort of start throwing the red meat until like the second hour, when I think people that are really with him would be there and other people wouldn't. And I think he sort of played to that crowd, as he always does. And then in the aftermath, it's like, okay, well, why didn't they stand? And it might have worked better for him than we might have initially thought. It
might have worked better for Trump.
Might have worked better for Trump than the initial analysis.
Yeah,
I disagree with that a little bit, because I don't know that come the midterms that's really going to resonate. Obviously, they can play the clip, but I think. And here's the thing. I'm not a politician, so it's easy for me to say this. But, if I were an elected Democrat in Congress, I wouldn't stand up in that situation, not for any reason as to I don't want to play Trump's game. Like, exactly what he's doing in that moment. And as soon as you choose to start playing his game and standing up when he's asking you to stand up, he's only going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
That's
and
true.
getting more material out of it. So I think politically, it makes sense, and at least includes less risk to just decide to boycott his game than to engage with it in any way. And, you know, is that really something as an issue that will animate voters in November, that Democrats didn't stand up in the State of the Union against for something that a president that is deeply unpopular was saying? Or, you know, I think people, you know, are a little bit smarter. I think people are smart enough to know what a political, just a political move is, just optics. When somebody's going for optics, what that looks like, and that's exactly what Trump did.
But just thinking about optics, I may be the only person who remembers this. No, you guys will remember it. In Biden's last State of the Union speech, he did a version of that when he sort of put Republicans on the spot, and he said, you know, you're going to cut Medicare, right?
Yeah.
And come on, you know you're going to do that. It was a little bit of the same thing. I think, Abdallah, you're probably right. It doesn't really matter to the average voter, and just something that we're like spending a lot of time analyzing.
as we always do.
Yeah.
It is interesting because I do remember that Republicans ended up applauding not cutting Medicare, and so then he was like, "There, I have them on the record. They're going to expand Medicare benefits or whatnot." I don't know what the political ramifications of that really were, but here we are.
Well, so maybe we should move on to a topic that people do really care about, namely snow.
Absolutely.
We've been talking about it in our office a whole lot for the last week or two. You know, snow removal is always a giant issue, whatever city you're in, whether it's Washington with 1 inch or, you know, Boston with 15 inches. One of the things we've been debating is whether the city, as opposed to individual tenants or landlords or owners, should be responsible for clearing their sidewalks. Very controversial issue. What do you guys think?
This is very explosive.
I know. I came down on that it should be sort of an individual responsibility. I mean, I guess if people are willing to pay more in taxes or are willing to pay for it, why not? But given that in Boston, at least, there have been a lot of, you know, sort of complaints about the tax increase that happened. I don't know how much more are people willing to pay to have that done rather than just go outside and shovel their walk or hire somebody to do it. But I don't live in the city, so maybe I have no right to say that.
But you do shovel your own walks.
I do shovel my own walks, yes.
I mean, I think of it not just in the context of Boston, but just cities generally, and what cities are supposed to provide their residents. And so, you know, when you think about how city government operates, really the most successful city government is the one that delivers good quality of life. And I think that creates a lot of peace in cities, that creates a lot of, you know, prosperity in cities, is just good governance at the nitty-gritty, day-to-day operations of city government. And one of the perfect examples of a well-functioning city government is whether or not it's able to plow snow or survive a natural disaster or recover from a natural disaster quickly enough. And if it's not a disaster, but something just like a snowstorm, even if it's a small snowstorm, if it can clear the roads and make it safe for people to move around, I think that's the ultimate marker of whether or not a city government is functioning well. And I always think, if city government is clearing the way for roads, is clearing the way for cars, why is it not doing the same for pedestrians? Ultimately, that's, I think, the difference between cities and suburbs. I think there's just more foot traffic, and so there's just more potential for hazardous conditions, especially for the elderly, especially for the disabled, when you rely on a patchwork of tenants and residents who may or may not shovel their snow. And you know, I think now there's just decades of, or centuries even, of evidence that, you know, it is too much of a patchwork. Like, part of the sidewalk may be extremely well paved, and all of a sudden, all it takes is just one house to not shovel their snow, and then suddenly you can't really finish the rest of your walk if you know, you're not very agile. So in that sense, I think it's an opportunity, if anything else. If nothing else, it's an opportunity for cities to remind residents, you know, what their government can do for them. You know, and this is like a small thing. It might be costly, but Other cities, we had a piece in the idea section, I think last year, from Miles Howard, that showed how other cities in Canada do this. And if Canada can do it, then I'm pretty sure the United States can afford to shovel some sidewalks too.
Well, don't underestimate the number of dog walkers in the suburbs. We've got lots of foot traffic.
Yeah.
But I do think that in Boston, that, you know, even though she might not acknowledge it, I think Mayor Wu did get the message about the importance of plowing streets and also keeping the piles of snow lower, because this latest snowstorm, the reviews seem to be that she did a better job.
Okay, yeah. Well, many a mayor has fallen because of poor snow removal. Well, let's hope that we're not talking about snow at our next time we get together. So thanks, you guys, for being here. Abdallah Fayyad is a writer for Globe Ideas. Joan Vennochi is a columnist for Globe Opinion. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.